Good day. Today is Saturday, 1st March 2025, and yesterday I found myself in a situation not entirely new, I have to say, if you do the kind of things that I do, make programs every day. Anyway, I found myself in the situation where I made a program. It was published on our various platforms. It discussed in detail Prime Minister Starmer's trip to the United States. It touched on the forthcoming trip of President Zelensky to the United States. At 1 hour, 20 minutes, it said that there was a possibility that President Zelensky, who must have felt very unhappy with the way that things had been turning out in the previous 2 weeks, it was possible that he might throw a scene. Anyway, I said all of that in my program, and of course, just around the time when the program was published, news started to pour in that the scene that I mentioned had indeed taken place, though on a scale and with a quality that I straightforwardly say I could never have imagined. I'm not going to say that my program was overtaken by events exactly. I think that explaining a lot of what had brought us to the point that we found ourselves in yesterday evening, I still think that was important. But anyway, certainly it did feel, as I said, as if all of those events, as the events of yesterday were playing out, the row in the White House was playing out, that again, my video had, well, shall we say, happened just after the most important event that it needed to cover of all. So what did happen in the White House? Well, we had a huge row. You can find the pictures of it on television. It involved Donald Trump, and it involved the Vice President, J.D. Vance. It also involved President Zelensky. And I'm going to say straight away that contrary to media commentary, especially in Europe, which implies that Zelensky was in some way ambushed by Trump and Vance, I think all of the facts strongly point against that conclusion, by the way. It's quite clear to me that the person who went to the White House essentially looking for a fight, or if not looking for a fight, seeking to get into a confrontation with the Americans all over again, was President Zelensky, and that it was he who provoked the row. Undoubtedly, and of this I am sure, there had already been rows taking place in private, but he came along and he provoked the whole row all over again in public, before the cameras, in the Oval Office, in a way that turned out to be disastrous for him. Anyway, let's recap and understand what happened in the context of the events of the last few weeks. Now, the key to this particular puzzle is the mineral extraction deal, the one that has been negotiated between the Americans and the Ukrainians, the one has caused all of this anger and controversy, and the deal that was supposed to have been signed yesterday, but which was not signed, and which it seems that Donald Trump, in disgust, has now written off. Now, I've said this previously, and of course I'm repeating myself, but on this issue I'm going to repeat myself again. The mineral deal, the mineral extraction deal, originated with President Zelensky himself. He came up with this idea back in the summer. He wanted to persuade the Americans to continue an indefinite commitment to Ukraine. He wanted to draw the Americans into the war in some form. He wanted security guarantees, as he put it, from the Americans. In effect, he wanted NATO membership. And in order to get all of that, he offered the Americans a bribe. He said that Ukraine is sitting on top of all of these enormously valuable minerals, this vast mineral wealth that that Ukraine supposedly, allegedly has, rare earths, manganese, lithium, all kinds of other strategic minerals. And Zelensky said, come along, give me my security guarantees, go on writing your open checks, go on supporting me in the same way as you have done, and eventually you will get it all back with interest by exploiting and developing and investing in our economy, by profiting from all this enormous, tremendous mineral wealth that we have. And he talked about that with his friend, or former friend, Lindsey Graham, in the summer. And Lindsey Graham was very keen on this idea, and he gave interviews which made many people think, by the way, that it was Lindsey Graham who first brought up this topic of the mineral deal, which, by the way, was not true. But anyway, Lindsey Graham brought this whole topic up. And then Zelensky met with Trump in Trump Tower in September, and he floated the minerals deal before Trump again, and he then discussed it in his so-called victory plan, which he first presented to the Americans and then which he presented in part, though not in whole, to the Ukrainian parliament. And apparently, after President Trump was inaugurated, he presented this minerals deal to the Americans all over again. And as I said, it was a bribe. It was essentially a bribe. It was a bribe to the Americans to keep them committed to Ukraine, to keep them committed to the war. Now, I've said this many times, but this is not widely reported, at least not widely reported in that way. But as it happens, this morning, there is an editorial in the Financial Times, which, by the way, sides with Zelensky over the quarrel that took place in the White House. And it says this: the Zelensky team made what turned out to be several miscalculations. One was to offer the United States a deal to share Ukraine's resources as part of a broader victory plan. This was meant to incentivize the White House to strengthen Kiev's hand before any talks with Moscow and provide a post-war security backstop to deter further Russian aggression. That goes a long way towards the truth, as I have set it out in program after program after program. It was indeed intended to incentivize the White House, the United States, to go on backing Ukraine. But it's a misconception that it was intended to put Ukraine in a better position ahead of negotiations. The Financial Times mentions Zelensky's victory plan. Well, a victory plan is not a plan that is put forward ahead of negotiations. It is what it is intended to be, what it calls itself: a plan to achieve victory over the Russians. And what Zelensky was trying to do with the minerals deal was to involve the United States, to recommit the United States to Ukraine, and eventually, through some kind of sleight of hand, to get the United States directly involved in confronting Russia and perhaps even fighting alongside Ukraine in the war. Now, again, the last point is controversial with some people, but again, if you've been reading people like Ian Proud, George Bieber, all sorts of other people like that, you can see that this has in fact been Ukraine's intention, Zelensky's intention, for a very, very long time. The Ukrainians, even Zelensky, understand that they cannot win the war by themselves. They lack the means, they lack the resources to defeat Russia. They can get weapons and military supplies from the United States and to some extent from their European friends. But if ultimately they are going to achieve victory, or so they believe, they must drag the United States itself into the war. They must get the Americans to take on the Russians, because in Europe, the United States is the only power with the military forces that could, even in theory, potentially defeat Russia's. So this has been Zelensky's plan, his purpose all along. And the mineral deal was basically bait offered to the Americans to lure them closer to the point where that objective could be achieved. Well, what then happened about 2-3 weeks ago was that the Americans said, fine, we do want the minerals deal. Donald Trump said to himself, this is the way that the United States is going to recoup all that money, all that investment that it's made in Ukraine. He puts the total sum at $350 billion. Zelensky says it's much less. Dr. Jack Rasmus thinks Trump's figure is probably closer to the truth. He's looked at the figures carefully. I think he's right. I'm not going to go into this in depth. Anyway, Donald Trump said that he did indeed want this mineral extraction deal. After all, the United States had already gone to extraordinary lengths to help Ukraine. It had supplied Ukraine with all kinds of modern weapons. It had accepted every request for weapons that the Ukrainians had made. This has been the consistent pattern of the Biden administration. It had given Ukraine extraordinary amounts of financial and economic aid. It pays the salaries of Ukrainian civil servants. It pays pensions. It pays apparently the salaries of the Ukrainian soldiers who fight on the battle lines. It backstops the Ukrainian budget in all kinds of different ways. So Trump said, we want to get at least some of that money back, and the minerals extraction deal is the way we're going to do it. Now, you might think that Trump was wrong to pursue this. Perhaps he should have looked at whether these strategic minerals in Ukraine even existed and where they were to be found, if they did exist. Most of them, or many of them apparently, are to be found on territory that the Russians now control. But it was something that Donald Trump went for. It's very much in his character. And eventually, and I think this became critically important, it became a kind of test of strength, a kind of test of wills between Trump and Zelensky, whether this deal would be done and on whose terms. And the American terms were absolutely clear. Donald Trump and his team, and there appears to be no dissent about this from any member of Donald Trump's team, do not want to involve the United States in the war in Ukraine. They do not want to commit more resources to the war. They are concerned that the war has become extremely dangerous, that it's escalated to the level where potentially a clash between the American and the Russian superpowers with unpredictable and unbelievably dangerous consequences might become a reality. And they also worry that Ukraine is going to lose the war anyway, and they feel strongly that they do not want to be dragged down by Ukraine's defeat in the way that the Lyndon Johnson and Nixon administration found themselves consumed by the war and defeat that the United States experienced in Vietnam. I'll come to this point a little later in the program, where I'm going to discuss further American concerns and intentions. So we could see that this set up a situation of dispute and even confrontation between the Americans and the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians offered a mineral extractions deal, but for them, the whole point about the deal was that it would be a deal which would commit the United States effectively to defense of Ukraine. It would, in effect, convert Ukraine into a military ally of the United States, which the United States would be bound to defend, whilst the Americans were looking for a purely economic agreement intended to compensate the Americans for bad money thrown away, some of which might potentially be recovered. And, well, there was a series of bruising encounters. Scott Bessent, the US Treasury Secretary, went to Kiev. He had a meeting with Zelensky. There was a vast row, apparently. There have been articles about this in the Daily Telegraph and the Financial Times. Zelensky started to shout at Scott Bessent because there were no security guarantees in the draft agreement that the Americans were coming forward with. He insisted on those security guarantees, as he calls them, which basically are not security guarantees. As my colleague and friend Alex Christoforou rightly points out, over the course of the previous year, Ukraine has signed 35 agreements with various countries around the world, including the United States, which at the time were presented as security guarantees. Though we hear nothing more of those various agreements, at the time we said on the Duran that they were worthless scraps of paper, and so it has turned out. It's fascinating how nobody talks about these agreements anymore. Just about 3 or 4 weeks ago, Ukraine signed what was supposed to be a treaty between itself and Britain, 100-year treaty with all kinds of security provisions as well. We see now what a completely worthless document that actually was. So when we talk about security guarantees, the security guarantees that the Ukrainians are angling for from the Americans, we need to understand that we're not really talking about security guarantees as such, not the kind of security guarantees that people have been talking about recently. We are talking about an outright military alliance, if not full membership of NATO, which Zelensky has repeatedly brought up. He has repeatedly insisted upon. He's been insisting upon it recently as the last couple of days. Something which, in effect, is exactly analogous to NATO membership. An alliance which would oblige the United States to defend Ukraine. So Zelensky wasn't getting that. He saw the Americans taking the bribe that he was offering to them and the Americans giving back nothing in return. And there was this huge row between himself and Scott Bassett. Trump was extremely angry about that. There was an intense meeting between Zelensky and Trump's envoy, Keith Kellogg. I pointed out at the time that there'd been no press conference, no questions, therefore, from the media. The only comment about that meeting was one from Kellogg, in which he spoke about an intense meeting between himself and Zelensky, which basically tells us that there'd been a row. And Zelensky was furious about the fact that he was not getting the security guarantees that he wanted. He spoke angrily about that to the media, and he provoked a ferocious response from Donald Trump on Truth Social, in which Trump spoke about the fact that Zelensky was this moderately successful comedian and dictator and all of those things. And as I said, the minerals extraction deal was at the core of the whole issue. But it actually goes beyond the mineral extractions deal, because the Americans want to end the war in Ukraine. They've been trying to get Zelensky to understand that that is what they want. They want an end to the war. They do not want to enter into an alliance with Ukraine. They know perfectly well that if they do, that could bring them into conflict with the other nuclear superpower, which is Russia, on territory, by the way, where, as Barack Obama pointed out all the way back in 2016 in an interview he gave to The Atlantic, the Russians would have the overwhelming advantage. A war which the American people would emphatically not support. The Americans do not want, therefore, to give Ukraine a treaty of alliance. They want to end the war in Ukraine. Now, here I would like to say something about American intentions, because I think there is a huge amount of misunderstanding about this. The Americans want to end the war in Ukraine, not because they're soft, not because they have suddenly discovered some great feelings of friendship towards the Russians. Trump does sometimes speak of his respect for Vladimir Putin, but he has repeatedly said, and he should be taken at his word about this, that what is driving him is the interests of the United States. And let us look at the situation in the conflict, in the war now, straightforwardly from the perspective of American interests. Back in February 2022, the universal assumption right across the collective West was that the war would end fast. The reason there was this expectation was because even though it was widely assumed that the Russian military would ultimately prevail in Ukraine if matters were left there, it was widely assumed that Russia would not be unable to withstand the colossal economic war that the United States launched against it, along with its European allies, in February 2022. This aimed at cutting off Russia's oil and gas exports to Europe. It froze Russian assets. It was assumed that this would create a massive crisis in the Russian financial system. Russian banks were cut off from SWIFT. Not all of them, but the key strategic banks were cut off from SWIFT. And there were even attacks on other aspects of the Russian economy. Russia was prevented from conducting airline links to Europe and the United States. This was a straightforward attempt to turn Russian oligarchs and the Russian middle class against Vladimir Putin. Anyway, overwhelming sanctions attack. I remember a Biden official at that time giving a briefing in the White House, bragging before the sanctions were imposed that the United States could go to the very upper limit of sanctions. They would go to the absolute maximum point and they would stay there. And the same official spoke about the one-dimensional nature of the Russian economy, and it was quite clear that the overwhelming expectations were that the Russian economy would be smashed. There was confident articles talking about Russia being pushed back to the 1990s, that Russian GDP would halve, that there would be an enormous economic crisis in Russia, hyperinflation, the ruble turned to rubble, all of those sort of things. And to everyone's dismay and surprise, it didn't happen. The Russian economy did absorb the sanctions shock remarkably quickly. It had stabilized by early spring, and by the autumn it was growing again. And this was completely unexpected. So, failure on the economic front led to a change of policy. Starting in the early summer of 2022, the United States started to supply weapons to Ukraine. Started with M777s, it then extended to HIMARS missiles. The East European states of NATO were prevailed upon, whether they didn't need much prevailing or persuasion. They were more than keen to do it, but they started to supply large quantities of tanks and armoured vehicles of former Soviet manufacture or built in these East European countries under Soviet licenses. Anyway, they started to supply these in huge quantities to Ukraine. And I remember reading articles in the American media at the time in which Biden administration officials were again bragging that these arms deliveries would be sufficient to hold back the Russian army, that they would be sufficient to keep the Russians at bay in Ukraine indefinitely. That was in the summer of 2022. Well, it didn't turn out like this. The Russians captured Mariupol, they captured the Severodonetsk, Lysychansk conurbation. They avoided the big defeat in Kherson region that many people expected, and they did withdraw from Kharkiv region, but again, they preserved intact their armed forces. And instead of looking for a way out of the war, as the Americans discovered when the then CIA director, Bill Burns, met with his Russian counterpart, Sergei Narishkin, in the autumn of 2022 in Ankara, the Russians, as a result of all of these steps, these American arms deliveries, started in the autumn of 2022 a massive armaments drive and a recruitment drive which looked like it was going to prolong the war. So then there was the last big military throw, the summer offensive of 2023, that it was expected would finally lead to Russia's defeat. It would break through to the Sea of Azov, to the Black Sea. It would isolate Crimea. That would finally bring Russia to the point of capitulation, which the sanctions had failed to achieve. which the American military supplies in 2022 had failed to push the Russians towards, except, of course, that the 2023 offensive, the Ukrainian 2023 offensive, failed as well. And from that point onwards, the United States, the Western powers, the Biden administration have had no plan. They've continued to supply weapons to Ukraine. The quantity and quality of those weapons has escalated. American military inventories have been drawn down. The failure of the Russian economy to collapse has led to an economic war of attrition between the Western powers and Russia, which has provoked huge inflationary pressures across the West, leading to falling wages, causing the defeat of the Democrats in the 2024 election, leading to deindustrialization processes and economic stagnation in Europe, and weakening the position of the United States in the rest of the world, and in particular in its competition with China. So there were good objective reasons for the United States, following the change of administration, to say to itself, this war has gone on long enough, it's exhausting resources, it is depleting arsenals, it is causing immense economic strains across the West, it's weakening America's position with respect to China. A particular plus, by the way, that China has obtained as a result of the war is that the friendship between China and Russia has solidified. So it makes total sense, looked at objectively from a perspective of American national interests, for the Americans to say enough is enough. We have got to find some way to end the war. But again, that collides with Ukrainian objectives, or at least with Zelensky's objectives. Because, as I have discussed again in program after program, the reality both of Zelensky himself and of the Maidan movement, of which he is now completely a part, is that the Ukrainians find it impossible to negotiate and reach compromises in good faith with their adversaries. This was the pattern of the Maidan movement throughout its political history. It could never find an acceptable compromise or modus vivendi with the political forces that opposed it within Ukraine itself, something which has been instrumental in creating the crisis in Ukraine in the first place. It has been ultimately one of the major sources of the war. The war is partly because of Ukraine's drive to join NATO, but it is also the product of Ukraine's inability to resolve its own domestic conflicts because of the refusal of the Maidan movement to compromise at any point on its maximalist objectives to achieve a unipolar, exclusively Ukrainian Ukraine. So they weren't prepared to compromise with their domestic opponents. They weren't prepared to fulfill the Minsk agreements. They pursued programs of rearmament. They went through the motions of negotiating with the Russians in the spring of 2022, but the Russians themselves now have serious doubts about how seriously the Ukrainians intended this. And from October 2022, when the Ukrainians believed that they had the complete and unconditional support of the West, they passed a law prohibiting themselves from engaging with the Russians in any sort of negotiations. And if you look at the various proposals that the Ukrainians have come up with since talk of negotiations has commenced, firstly, it was Zelensky's peace plan, which demanded Russia's unconditional capitulation. Then it was Zelensky's victory plan, which, as I said, by definition, aimed for victory over the Russians. And yes, at times Zelensky has talked about his readiness to negotiate with the Russians, but he always demands things that he knows the Russians would never accept to: European peacekeeping forces, unconditional American guarantees, long-range missiles, all of those things, which are calculated to prolong the war and to involve the United States in it so that Ukraine can achieve its victory. The Ukrainian objective is not to make peace. It is to achieve victory over Russia. It cannot do it itself. It has to involve the United States, and that has been the objective of Ukrainian diplomacy, well, for years now. So, again, the Americans, who want to end the war, found that in Zelensky, in the Ukrainians, they did not have a willing partner. The Ukrainians, angry about the fact that the Americans were forcing them to sign a mineral extraction deal, which the Ukrainians had proposed, but which did not come with the guarantee, the alliance with the United States that they were looking for, and the Americans wanting to start a peace process with the Russians, that the Ukrainians also were not interested in, even because the Ukrainians are still seeking victory over the Russians, a victory achieved for them ultimately by the United States. So this set up the confrontation. This is what ultimately set up the confrontation that took place yesterday. Now, the mood would have been soured further by what happened over the preceding days. The Americans, by 2 weeks ago, were already very, very angry with the Ukrainians. Donald Trump was becoming increasingly exasperated with Zelensky, as he made clear in his posts on Truth Social. Zelensky's refusal to sign the mineral deal without a military alliance, Zelensky's refusal to take any serious steps to negotiate with the Russians, the Ukrainians furious with the Americans because they were being pushed into signing a military extraction deal which did not come with a promise of a military alliance, and by the fact that they were being pushed into a peace deal with the Russians when what they actually want is victory. But what happened over the previous week, over the week after we started to see the relationship between the Ukrainians and the Americans start to break down, as I said, made the situation worse, because the Ukrainians, as they always do, contacted their friends in Europe, the British, the French. I discussed yesterday at great length in my program how it was clearly agreed between the three of them that the Ukrainians would promise to sign the mineral extraction deal, but that the British and the French would get the promise of the military alliance with the United States that the Ukrainians were looking for. It It was not, of course, it would not, of course, have been a straightforward military alliance. It would have been an American guarantee to support British and French peacekeepers in Ukraine. But, as I discussed yesterday, the logic of that, the logic of the United States promising to come to the defense of British and French peacekeepers in Ukraine, the logic of that would have led inexorably to the United States coming to the defense of Ukraine itself. It was a trick, it was a subterfuge, one that the Americans immediately saw through, but one which very foolishly, very recklessly, the Europeans, on behalf of the Ukrainians, tried to pull off. So we had visits to the United States, to Washington, first by Emmanuel Macron and by Keir Starmer. And I spoke yesterday in my programme about the skill with which Donald Trump deflected the British and French requests for military guarantees for their troops. It was clear that the Americans had seen through what the British and the French were all about. But of course, and inevitably, the fact that the British and the French were engaging in all of these devices and were clearly doing so on Zelensky's behalf would have soured the mood of the Americans further. And of course, we can also see how, from a Ukrainian point of view, the failure of the British and the French to get those military guarantees from the Americans would have soured the mood in Ukraine. Zelensky had already said that he was not really willing to sign the mineral extraction deal without a security guarantee. His Prime Minister Shmyhal, made the same point. Other Ukrainian officials have talked in exactly the same way. They'd been apparently given assurances by the French and the British that this would somehow be achieved. Trump, by this time already very angry with Zelensky and clearly mistrusting him, wanted to cancel Zelensky's visit to Washington, the one that took place yesterday, but he was talked into allowing it to happen by Emmanuel Macron. Macron always, by the way, overestimates his own persuasive skills. He appears to have believed that he could somehow trick Donald Trump or fool Donald Trump into giving some kind of guarantee to the British and the French, which would then enable Zelensky to come to Washington, sign the mineral extraction agreement, and then there would be the guarantee. And as it's now clear, Macron and Starmer had arranged for the European states already to meet over this weekend, and it was clearly intended that they would then be moving forward to agree with the peacekeeping force or reassurance force, or perhaps more correctly, intervention force, European intervention force in Ukraine, relying on the backstop that they'd obtained from the Americans. So you'd have had the backstop conceded by Trump over the course of Macron's and Starmer's visit. You'd have had Zelensky coming away with the mineral extraction deal, but there would have been the backstop behind it. And then over the weekend, the details of the intervention force would have been worked out by the British and the French with their European friends. And it would all have been, to be said frankly, a very, very dangerous situation. But of course, Trump, as I said, didn't fall for it. He didn't give the British and the French the so-called backstop, the guarantee that they were looking for and that they promised Zelensky. So Zelensky again came to Washington on Friday in a furious mood, asked to sign a mineral extractions deal without a security guarantee, giving the Americans the bribe without getting the military alliance with the United States that he'd expected to get in return. And as I said in my program yesterday, he clearly was fuming. You could sense the anger, and you could also sense, as I said in my program, 1 hour, 20 minutes, you can find it. It was not impossible that given how angry he was, he would throw a scene. And that is exactly what led us to the situation yesterday. The Ukrainians, Zelensky, as soon as he arrived in Washington, it became again very, very clear that he was not really interested in the mineral extraction deal. It was far from certain that he would sign it. He was again trying to revise the terms of the minerals extraction deal to get the security guarantee, the military alliance with the United States that the Americans had already refused. He'd been warned in advance by the US Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, who made the comment yesterday before, or that was the day before yesterday, before Zelensky arrived, that the deal was agreed, that it would be as written out without an American security guarantee, that it would be completely wrong for Zelensky to try to renegotiate it. The fact that Bessent said all of that was clearly a sign of the trouble that was coming. And, well, sure enough, Zelensky paid no attention to what Bessent said and tried to renegotiate the deal all over again to get that military alliance from the United States that he's been angling for all along, and which the Americans had flatly and categorically refused to give him. So by the time of the Oval Office meeting, the one that appeared before the cameras, the mood would already have been a very, very bad one. This is, I think, the key to understanding what happened. Now, had Zelensky been a conventional politician, had he been somebody who had genuine understanding of the best interests of his country, he would have approached this whole situation in a very different way. Obviously, he had not got the military alliance that he was looking for. But the Americans, by this point, had committed themselves to getting the mineral extraction deal. He ought to have realized that re-arguing the topics, the issues of the mineral extraction deal all over again would not be advisable, would not be wise, would inevitably infuriate the Americans. He wouldn't have done it. He'd have come into the White House properly dressed in a suit and tie with an iron shirt on. He would have given himself a shave. He'd have spoken to Donald Trump, explained to Donald Trump how grateful Ukraine was for the unstinting support it has received from the United States. He'd have said the usual cliches and bromides about the cause of freedom and how Ukraine was fighting for freedom and how it was inspired by all that the United States stood for and had achieved to do so, how Ukrainians sought to be like Americans, that kind of thing. He'd have signed the deal, it would have been all smiles, all handshakes, all that kind of thing. And he'd have walked away, obviously, with a minerals extraction deal that, in some ways, is deeply unfavourable to Ukraine, but which in practice means nothing, because the details have never been worked out. And as I discussed in another program I did, I think about 2 days ago, ultimately they cannot be worked out, because nothing about this deal actually ultimately in the end makes any sense. But Zelensky would have made a favourable impression on the Americans. He'd have told the Americans that he fully understands their concerns about the endless war, that he does indeed want to negotiate with the Russians. In fact, he's keen to negotiate with the Russians. But obviously, he will do so from a perspective of defending Ukraine's national interests. That would have been the obvious and correct thing for Zelensky to do. Well, he didn't do any of those things. He came to the White House again in his jacket, his khaki jacket, and with his unshaved look, the Che Guevara look. It's bizarre that he continues to do this when he went to the US Congress in the autumn of 2022 and dressed in the same way and put on the same performance. Many people in the United States, in Congress and outside, took it badly that he appeared dressed in that sort of way. If Zelensky has a proper team of people advising him, or if he listens to a proper team, if he is being given that advice, he would have known not to do this again, not to go to the White House dressed in this dishevelled Che Guevara outfit that he now wears all the time. There's been a feeble attempt in The Guardian to try and defend this, saying that, Zelensky dresses in this way to impress on people the fact that Ukraine is at war. The British constantly bring up parallels between this war and the Second World War. I don't think any of those parallels are meaningful, but since they do so, let me point out that Winston Churchill, the British leader of that time, whenever he met foreign leaders, whenever he met Roosevelt and any of the others, he was impeccably dressed. He got beautiful tailored suits made for him by the elite British tailor, Henry Poole. They're still open in Savile Row, by the way. Britain was at war at that time. Churchill did have more relaxed outfits. In fact, he designed one himself. He sometimes wore uniforms and things of that kind. But he understood that there is a time and a place for those things, and a time and a place for formal wear. Zelensky, it seems, does not. He likes to put on this performance, and of course it infuriated the Americans. But all right, that would have passed. He was asked questions about it by the media pool, which he didn't really answer. But anyway, so be it. But then, of course, Zelensky again tried to relitigate the whole issue, reopen the whole discussion. I'm sure he was doing this already in private. He did it again in front of the television cameras. Trump and J.D. Vance were incensed about this. Vance told him straight out, it's absolutely inappropriate and disrespectful to do this in this place with the television cameras and the media present in that kind of way, trotting out again demands for security guarantees, military alliances, all of those things that the United States has already rejected. But of course, Zelensky is deaf to all of those things. And from that moment on, the row escalated in the way that we've all seen. Zelensky's body language, by the way, was appalling. Rolling eyes, squared shoulders, that kind of thing, which would have provoked the Americans and angered them even more. And the result was the disastrous scenes that we saw yesterday. There's been attempts, as I said, especially in the European media and in parts of the American media too, to try to blame this whole disastrous episode on Trump and Vance. Well, it's certainly the case that American anger, Trump's anger and Vance's anger, finally boiled over during that meeting in the Oval Office. But it was Zelensky's conduct that brought that about. Now, whether this was Zelensky's intention is, of course, a completely different matter. Because, in a sense, Zelensky behaved yesterday no differently from the way that he always behaves. As I said, he always wears this khaki jacket and this unshaved look. As I said, it's become his look now. So obviously he's reluctant to change this. But his entire style has been to come to countries that have provided Ukraine with huge amounts of support and insult his donors, tell them you're not providing enough, you're never giving us enough, all the weapons that we need, you've given us some weapons but not enough weapons, we need twice as many or 3 times as many or 10 times as many weapons. And it's your fault, therefore, that we're still losing because you're not giving us all the weapons that we need. He insults his donors. He never really thanks them. He makes exorbitant, extreme demands. Bear in mind that European weapons inventories are practically depleted. I did a program some time ago based on an article in the Financial Times pointing out that the British Armoured Division has no infantry fighting vehicles and is down to 12 guns because of the huge numbers of weapons that have been shipped off to Ukraine. The Bundeswehr, the German army, is in apparently the same condition. The French army might be slightly better, but probably not much. Denmark apparently has no self-propelled howitzers left. The Europeans have been giving away fighter jets, doing all of these kind of things. All of these countries, including, by the way, the United States, have been affected by the sanctions and the economic war against Russia. They've all experienced falls in living standards, high inflation, deindustrialization in the case of Germany and some of the other European countries. Zelensky never acknowledges any of this. He comes, he makes unceasing demands. He wants more and more. And he never shows any regard for the wider potential consequences. The military alliance that he's angling for with the United States, clearly intended to use the Americans to defeat the Russians, to get the Americans involved in the war against the Russians. And, well, Joe Biden himself, as president, said that a situation where Russian and American troops are fighting each other is World War III. And Zelensky pays no heed to that. He continues to push that agenda. And, well, that provoked the comment from Trump yesterday that he is gambling with World War III, which is exactly what he's doing. He's agitated for missile strikes deep inside Russia, crossing a real Russian red line, something that never happened at any point during the Cold War. The Russians have shown extraordinary restraint in the face of this. But anyway, Zelensky shows no heed to that. He's like, by the way, the Maidan movement, the Ukrainian nationalist movement in general, single-mindedly focused on one objective, which is the Ukrainianization of Ukraine, within its 1991 borders and the defeat of Russia, a nuclear superpower which Ukraine can never defeat by itself. So the Americans, basically, they got another dose of Zelensky, no different from the usual Zelensky that one sees, right? The arrogance, the sense of entitlement, the, as I said, exorbitant demands. And finally, what happened yesterday in the Oval Office is that the Americans said enough. And apparently, and despite some of the media reports, it seems that the Americans escorted Zelensky off the premises, out of the White House. He didn't leave by himself. He was told to leave. And Zelensky was told, don't come back until and unless you want peace. So there we go. Now, this deconstruction of the arguments that took place yesterday doesn't come close to capturing the intensity of the anger. Both the American anger, and as I said, you could see Trump and Vance boiling over. And note again that the entire US government is backing them. Rubio, Hexas, even Lindsey Graham has now parted ways with Zelensky and is saying that Zelensky needs to step down. Similar anger on Zelensky's side, because he has become used always to getting what he wanted. He came along to the Americans. He would demand, well, first he wanted HIMARS systems, and he got them. Then he wanted infantry fighting vehicles and tanks, and he got those too. Then he wanted ATACMS missiles, and of course he got those. Then he wanted fighter jets. He got all of that as well. He has developed this belief that not only is he entitled to whatever he wants, entitled to whatever money the Americans give, endless flows of money, endless flows of blank checks and things of that kind, but endless quantities of weapons sent to him. And as I said, he always comes back for more. And, well, suddenly he found the Americans saying no. And, well, you could see from his behavior in the Oval Office that he didn't like that at all. Now, there are claims, and I am not able to verify these claims, that the microphones actually caught him swearing. It wouldn't surprise me at all. I want to stress, I am unable to hear this myself, and I know the Russian word that he's supposed to have used, and by the way, it was a Russian word, and I know what it means, but I didn't hear it. Perhaps he did say it. I think almost certainly he did say it, but I'm not going to search out and establish whether he said it or not. Anybody who's followed Zelensky knows that this man uses profane language regularly. He did so quite recently in an interview he gave with an American blogger. I pointed out at the time in a program that I did that in Russia and Ukraine, using profane language the way Zelensky uses it is actually profoundly shocking. I've mentioned in previous programs, based on reports in the American media, about how Zelensky sometimes screams at his generals. So, without saying that he did actually say this word, it would be completely in character if he did. And because he's used this kind of language before, I'm inclined to think that he did. If he did, there will be consequences. Trump and Vance will undoubtedly be getting reports about it from the people who were recording Zelensky's words, and well, let's say it's not going to make them any more happy and any more inclined to support Zelensky from this point going forward. Now, where does this leave us? Apparently, after Zelensky and his entourage left the White House, they began to realize what a disastrous mistake they'd made. They tried, apparently, to patch things up. They telephoned the White House several times. They said that they would sign the deal, after all, unamended. They would come back and they would do it. And completely unsurprisingly, after what happened, the Americans said no. They would not agree. And apparently, Trump, for the moment at least, has given up on the minerals extraction deal. Now, I have to say this. I think the Americans not only were right not to let Zelensky return, it would have been an extraordinary thing to do after the scenes in the Oval Office. But knowing Zelensky, had he returned, I can very easily see how the whole thing might have started all over again. Because the one thing that is obvious, it's been obvious to me for a very long time, is that Zelensky never gets the message. He won't take no for an answer. His arrogance and his sense of entitlement is not changed. And though most probably, if he'd been allowed back into the White House, he'd have signed the minerals extraction deal, it's not impossible that he would have made yet another attempt to bring up the security guarantee issue all over again. So there we go. Now, where does this take us? Donald Trump has made a statement that unless Zelensky comes back and finally does talk peace, the United States has had enough. They'll wash their hands of the whole affair. They'll let the Russians and the Ukrainians fight it out. And, well, we can guess what the outcome of that is going to be. I've always felt myself that this is quite likely where all of this was going to go. Zelensky is going to find it very, very difficult to walk back many of the things that he said. He went on to Fox News and gave an interview shortly after the events at the White House. He showed himself completely the same as the man who had been in the White House. He started harping on again about security guarantees and European peacekeeping forces. He refused to apologise for anything that had happened in the White House. He remained exactly the same person as before. A further reason, by the way, why I think that if he had gone back to the White House, it's quite possible that the whole scene would simply have repeated itself all over again. I've said in several programs now that I don't think Zelensky himself will ever negotiate seriously to achieve peace. Even if he is brought to the negotiating table, all that he will do is he will maneuver and intrigue, try to play his European friends off against the Americans, do all that he can to again try to find some way to involve the Americans in the war. Now, there's been a lot of discussion and debate about taking steps, the Ukrainians now taking steps to arrange for Zelensky to go. Lindsey Graham, his former backer in the United States, has said that Zelensky should resign. Zelensky has floated the possibility over the last couple of days of resigning, but as I've said already, when you unpack what he actually says, he's not really offering to resign. He's just making another rhetorical pose, because he says in return that he wants automatic entry into NATO, American security guarantees, European peacekeeping forces, all of those things. I don't think Zelensky, temperamentally, psychologically, politically, is in any position to proceed with any kind of peace deal with the Russians. I think that possibility is gone. Maybe in April 2022, if Boris Johnson and the Biden people hadn't worked on him, he might have signed the Istanbul Agreement at that time. Whether he'd have honoured it, by the way, in light of the person he's become, is another matter. Just saying. But maybe then the Zelensky we had at that time might have been prepared to make peace, but I don't think he is prepared to make peace now. Trump and Vance have clearly come to that view. They said to him quite straightforwardly, you are not interested in making peace. I've been saying that, as I said, in video after video. I've been following Zelensky for years. The Americans have now reached that same conclusion. I think Kellogg probably has. I think that the Americans collectively have. And the American imperative to cut the losses in the war that I discussed earlier remains in place. There's now worries that the Americans might stop supplying arms to Ukraine. I think that's highly likely. Why would they go on supplying arms to sustain the Ukrainians in a war the Americans know is lost? Trump and Vance all but said that to Zelensky over the course of the Oval Office meeting. Why would the Americans go on doing that, given Zelensky's complete uninterest in seeking peace? So quite plausibly, the Americans might stop the arms supplies to Ukraine. Supposedly, Ukraine has enough weapons to keep fighting until midsummer. Then, of course, problems will grow. They will probably escalate. But I've always had this sense that in Ukraine, there's probably, amongst some people there, including, I suspect, some people in Zelensky's entourage, and maybe Zelensky himself, that outright defeat is somehow preferable to an agreement on Russian terms, which would defeat the Maidan project, the Ukrainian national project, once and for all. Better a glorious defeat where you can talk about the good old cause, you know, in the coffee houses in Toronto or wherever it is these people will congregate, in Paris maybe. Pretend to yourself that were it not for the West's betrayal, you still would have won. Talk about the wickedness of the Russians, all of that kind of thing. Rather than work towards a proper settlement. Now, there may, of course, and there probably are, many people in Ukraine who think otherwise. I discussed that article which has recently appeared in The Spectator, which said that things are now so bad in Ukraine that it's not implausible that a majority of Ukrainians might even back a pro-Russian leader in order to achieve peace, or might even prefer rule under Russia to indefinite war. But the reality is that the Ukrainian nationalist movement, Zelensky's people, are in control in Kiev. They control the militias, or at least they have the support of the militias, the nationalist militias. They control the security apparatus, which is extremely ruthless. And by the way, one of the best things that came out of that confrontation in the Oval Office was J.D. Vance's final statement about some of the realities that are playing out in Ukraine at the present time. The fact that men are being seized on the streets and press ganged into the war. Something which I noticed, by the way, Zelensky did not dispute. Anyway, given those realities, perhaps expecting some change of regime in Ukraine now is expecting a great deal. Perhaps Zelensky will be shuffled off the scene, though he shows no desire or interest to go. But even if he is, given the setup at the moment, the person who would probably replace him, Zelensky, Poroshenko, whoever, would also come from within the Ukrainian nationalist movement. And as I discussed in a recent program, and as Putin has pointed out, that really might not solve the situation in any realistic way. It might mean that the conflict would simply continue, but under a new leader who was perhaps a little more rational than Zelensky is. I have to say that, in my opinion, the best moment to have ejected Zelensky from his position as Ukraine's leader, even for his domestic political opponents, has now gone. His term expired last year. His constitutional term expired last year. But the entire political class in Ukraine has basically gone along with the fact that Zelensky remained Ukraine's president, despite the absence of elections and despite the expiry of his term. As a result, it seems to me that Zelensky's power in Ukraine has, if anything, actually increased. And, well, there are reports, rumours, they may be true, that Zelensky now has, on top of everything else, a French bodyguard, and Emmanuel Macron and the Europeans continue to support Zelensky. So, given that that is so, that probably also strengthens his position and makes it very problematic for some kind of internal coup to be successfully conducted against him. So I think that there's a fairly strong chance that he will remain in position, that any attempt to remove him is going to face enormous problems, and that he will continue to lead Ukraine into the abyss of military defeat. At this point, I have to say something about the Europeans, because almost without exception, they have sided with Zelensky against Trump in this quarrel. Now, this is incredibly reckless, especially given Zelensky's behaviour. The Europeans talk to themselves about the dangers to the Western alliance, to NATO. They seem to be completely oblivious that their own inability to recognise America's needs and priorities, the fact that the United States needs to end the war, that it needs to start conserving its inventories and deploying its forces in other places, imposes on the United States an imperative which any American president, whoever that was, would be confronted with. The Europeans seem to be in complete denial about this. They continue to insist with the same kind of extreme entitlement that Zelensky has, that the Americans must continue to support them indefinitely and in an unlimited way, because that's what's happened before, and that's what the Americans must continue to do, whatever the wider changes in the world. And the fact is that the Europeans are in no position, in reality, to deliver on any of the promises to the Ukrainians that they still make. They talk about a massive program of rearmament. I've already discussed in many places how difficult that is. But with the best will in the world, if the Europeans do now embark on a crash program of rearmament, it would still take them probably a decade before their militaries were in any better position than the one that they are in now. I read a very interesting article in the Daily Telegraph which spoke about how, in order to rebuild the British military, it would need to increase, Britain would need to increase defence spending to 3.5% of GDP. Something, by the way, which is unaffordable. It would result in a major fiscal crisis in Britain. Starmer has basically scrapped the overseas aid budget to try to increase defence spending from 2.3% to 2.5%, and he's already lost a cabinet minister as a result of resignation of that. I think that the idea that Britain could simply increase defence spending to 3.5% is a fantasy at this time. But when I saw what increasing defence spending to 3.5% would deliver, I find myself asking, why even bother? It would result apparently in 10,000 extra soldiers. 10,000 extra soldiers. The British military would grow from 75,000 to 85,000. The size of a single Russian group of forces. The Russian military, as I said already, 10 times bigger than the British. 10,000 more men. More or less? What difference is that going to make? Anyway, put that aside. Even if they were to embark on a crash program of rearmament, it would not be enough to help Ukraine. And what help to Ukraine do they think they can give? The infantry fighting vehicles, the Bradleys, they come from the United States. The Europeans have sent some, but nowhere near as many as the Americans can send. Not just Bradleys, of course, but Strikers. The Russians claim that they destroyed 300 Striker armoured personnel carriers in Kursk region alone. That's as many armoured personnel carriers as you would find in most European armies. Just saying. Surface-to-air missiles. The Americans just managed to eke out production of Patriot missile interceptors. How are the Europeans going to replace those? What European analogue is there to ATACMS? Even if the Europeans could find such an analogue, and of course they got Taurus missiles and all of those, but let's say they did develop some kind of missile that could match or be comparable to the ATACMS, which wouldn't need to be air-launched in the way that the Taurus missiles and the Storm Shadows and the Scout missiles are. In order to penetrate Russian defences, they would presumably still need the data that only the Americans can supply. What analogue is there to the American Starlink system if the Americans decide to switch off Starlink, or to be more precise, if Elon Musk does? Now, the Americans might, by the way, decide to leave Starlink alone. It doesn't cost them very much to continue to provide Ukraine with the inputs of the Starlink system. It doesn't deplete inventories, American inventories, in the same way. But, well, ultimately, if the Americans were to decide to switch off Starlink, there is no European analogue. The Europeans have talked big talk about deploying European forces to Ukraine, but just a week or so, 2 weeks ago, Starmer himself was saying that it could not happen without an American backstop. So if the American backstop is not there, what realistically can the Europeans do? And what strategy to win the war do they have, or to negotiate with the Russians? The Danish Prime Minister has talked appallingly about how war is better than peace in Ukraine. War is better than peace on Russian terms. In other words, go on losing. I'm sure you would have found all kinds of people in the Chancellery in Berlin saying exactly that in the summer of 1944. It's just saying, but we all know what that eventually led to. It's depressing to see European leaders repeating those extraordinary tropes and cliches. The Europeans have no strategy for victory, no strategy for negotiations. They cannot do any of this without the United States. So why do they insist on attaching themselves to this sinking ship that is Vladimir Zelensky? Do they really think that his conduct in the White House was appropriate? Do they really feel that his actions served Ukrainian interests? Why don't they do what the Russians have said and what the Americans have said, which is if they want to talk to the Russians, nothing prevents them doing so. They could have backed Viktor Orban's mission to Moscow and Kiev, and by the way, Beijing and Washington in the summer. Instead, they badmouthed Orban. Well, perhaps the time has come to do the same. I was reading how Bloomberg is now, I read in Bloomberg how businesses in Eastern Germany are anxious to start getting Russian pipeline gas again. Why are European politicians so indifferent to the condition of their own people that they want to press on with this unsuccessful losing project? As I said, it defies understanding. But I'm not going to explore all of that in this program. As I said, I think more likely than not, we are not going to see any progress towards peace in Ukraine. I can't imagine that the mineral extraction deal will be revived in any significant form. Why would the Americans be interested, given what they've seen Zelensky's like? And besides, over time, the Americans will no doubt discover how empty of content that deal really is. So, more likely than not, the Americans will now gradually start to do what Donald Trump says. They will start to walk away, at which point the Ukrainians will start to lose and the war will come to an end. And in the meantime, well, it seems to me that the Americans now have every reason to just press forward with the normalization process with the Russians. The Russians have, by the way, now provided information about the meeting in Istanbul that took place on Thursday. I was concerned yesterday that they had not, but now they provided quite a lot of information. And it does seem as if that meeting did make serious progress after all. The Americans have agreed to the appointment of a new Russian ambassador. We have details of who this person is. He appears to be a very, very able man. and it seems that other progress was made on many, many other issues. I don't see any reason now for the Americans to slow down on any of that. No doubt they will be called all sorts of rude things by the governments of Europe, but the Americans are acting rationally. The Europeans are not. Let them move forward, therefore, with normalization, with Russia, which serves American national interests, which is what any American government ought to be focused on. Well, this is where I end my program today. I've not had time, obviously, to discuss the military situation in Ukraine. I will try to do that in my next program. Though, to be frank, I have to say that after the events of the last 24 hours, I wonder how much point there is to discuss the details of what is happening on the front lines, given that a huge event has taken place which is going to bring us closer to the point of war end. Let me just finish by reminding you once again that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble, X, and other places. You can also support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, and by going to our shop, links under this video. Last but not least, please remember, if you've liked this program, to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.